Now, just on a year after William Kavanagh arrived, and even as the very first wave of Galway immigrants were arriving here directly from Ireland, two Scottish brothers took ship from Melbourne for Otago, having arrived there a little earlier from Liverpool. The Shannon brothers fitted the original Otago pioneer profile perfectly. Not only were they Scottish and members of the Free Church, they were also young men of ability come to Otago to seek their fortunes. Not for them, however, the small plots of land in and around Dunedin. Alexander Shannon, aged 24, and his younger brother Watson, aged 22, had come looking for good country for sheep. They wasted no time in heading inland to explore. They soon reached the limits of settlement, John Cargill's sheep run, on the inner edge of the Tokomairero plain. Beyond that lay the whole of central Otago, still untapped and unexplored, but also tough to reach. The two young men rode their horses uphill and downdale, pushing through wild scrub and tussock and swimming their horses across wild rivers until they reached the Manuherikia Valley. Here they found exactly what they were looking for, a great tract of open country that no other Pākehā had yet reached, and grand hills for sheep. After 3 rugged weeks in the saddle, they climbed over the Lammerlaw Range and returned to Tokomairero. At the Land Office in Dunedin, they took out applications for 40,000 acres for 2 pastoral runs, the first to be taken up so far inland in Otago. They named them Galloway, after their home district in Scotland, and Motori, a Maori word that described its location. And they now had 6 months to stock their runs with sheep, after which they would have secured a depasturing licence for 14 years for a small annual fee. After a lot of incredibly hard work and many trials and tribulations that we don't have time to go into the details of here, this initiative would produce lucrative returns. Others quickly followed the trail blazed by the Shannon brothers. A race for sheep runs in inland Otago took off, and a pastoral boom began in Otago, fueled by the profits from wool. The Shannon boys came from a family that farmed here at Ledloch in Galloway. Their father was an award-winning breeder of Galloway cattle, and their grandfather had been a leading agriculturalist in this region. So this was a family at the top of contemporary Scottish farming practice, clever, successful, and at the cutting edge of agricultural innovation. But they were still only tenants, and there were too many of them. Alexander and Watson were 2 of 11 children, 8 of them boys. And although their father farmed properties that were substantial by Scottish standards, they were never going to be enough to provide a living for so many. Looking overseas for new opportunities was a sound family strategy. 5 of the Shannon boys would go to New Zealand in the end, as well as 2 of their sisters plus their husbands. The road to colonial prosperity was not an easy one, however. Alexander Shannon, for example, after 3 years hard graft here in Otago, went back to Scotland to secure better breeding stock. Travelling via Europe, he managed to buy some pedigree merino rams and ewes from the King of Prussia's famous Potsdam stud. Arriving safely in New Zealand, these Prussian sheep boosted the quality of the Shannon's flock and added to their reputation as innovators. But Alexander himself never returned. He enrolled at the University of Edinburgh, but in June 1862, he died of typhoid. The hard years in Otago were said to have taken their toll on his health. Watson, on the other hand, also returned to Scotland for a visit in the 1860s, starting off some of his Otago runs. But in 1868, he took up Puketoi Station here in the Maniatoto, which he built up into one of the most successful in Otago. In 1878, he moved south to Conical Hills, which he also developed into a model estate. As time passed, he became the most important man in the district, something of a country squire type figure of the sort that Edward Gibbon Wakefield would have so strongly approved. He got married, had a family, and became extremely wealthy. Then in 1903, he retired to Dunedin and had the noted Scottish Otago architect R.A. Lawson design this magnificent mansion for him on High Street with sweeping harbour views and a ballroom in the basement. He called it Thrieve after an historic castle near his home, Leadlock in Galloway, and here he lived out his final years. Soon after moving in, he also applied for his own coat of arms from the Scottish heraldry authorities. At its centre was the figure of an explorer, dressed for the road and ready to go. And as a motto, he chose Virtute Duce, or in English, by virtue in the lead. It was a motto he had earned in those tough early years with his brother as they pushed their flocks inland, exploring, and took all that the harsh environment of central Otago could throw at them. And not a bad achievement for a middling farmer's son from far off Leadlock in Galloway. So what do we learn from the lives of Watson and Alexander Shannon?
The Shannon brothers were a fine example of seeing what Otago could offer, provided you were willing to take the opportunity and put in the groundwork toil.
The wealth coming from pastoral farming was slowly transforming Dunedin in the late 1850s. This photograph from 1859 provides a snapshot of the run holders who were emerging as Otago's new elite. They established a club on a site now occupied by Harvey Norman here in McLagan Street. It was called the Squatters Club, and it provided a place where they could socialise together in a more exclusive environment. Now that might seem far removed from the egalitarian ideals of the original Free Church settlement, but some of the pioneers did in fact become members, including Captain Cargill's son John, and the Fultons, who are also by now run holders. Watson Shannon was also a member. The club itself was eventually renamed the Dunedin Club, and it has survived to the present. Still an exclusive place for Dunedin's elites to mix and mingle. Since 1874, it's been based here in Melville Street. Its honours boards are a roll call of Dunedin's business and social life since the 1850s. But the building itself has a connection which takes us even further back, right to the very beginning of European settlement in Otago. For this house was built by Johnny Jones, the rough and ready son of ex-convicts who grew up on the Sydney docks and first came to southern New Zealand in the 1830s on whaling ships. Settled at Waikouaiti since 1843, Jones had then thrown in his lot with the New Zealand Company settlers at Dunedin when they arrived 5 years later. His store on the shoreline was one of the most important businesses in the original township, a major supplier of foodstuffs in the first years of the settlement. Though he always remained something of a rough diamond, Jones prospered along with Dunedin. He also invested in sheep runs in the 1850s, and he was a member of the Squatters Club. He built this house in 1867, but he only got to live there for 2 years before he died at the age of 60 in 1869. His life's trajectory too shows a remarkable rise from humble origins to substantial wealth. Meanwhile, Captain Cargill died in August 1860, and his passing symbolised the end of the era of the first settlers and of the Wakefield class settlement, which he'd tried so valiantly to create, but which had proved somewhat impractical on the ground. His death also saw new developments in the future of Otago, even before the discovery of gold in the following year. And it seems somehow appropriate that he should have passed on, shuffled off the mortal stage, just before that great watershed in Otago history.
It was a timely death, both for the man himself and for the legend he was to leave behind. He had lived long enough to hold the new community together and see it safely established. Yet he died before the gold rushes irrevocably changed the direction of Otago's development. Even though he'd lived long enough to see the demise of many aspects of class settlement, he died happy in the knowledge that Otago was still essentially Presbyterian Scottish and governed by the proprietor class. The reality of the egalitarian, secular and heterogeneous challenge of the gold miners still lay in the future.
Gold led to a whole new phase of Otago history. The gold seekers trampled across the dreams of pioneer Presbyterians and warlords alike. For good reason, the Presbyterians scathed the newcomers as the new iniquity come amongst them. For indeed they came from all over, Germans and Scandinavians, English and Irish, and all parts in between. A later cohort included Cantonese Chinese, who added the first substantial non-European migrant group to the Otago mix. But many of the miners were Scots too, perhaps more than from any other national group. They reinforced the foundation group's ethnic base and ensured that even after the gold rushes, Otago and Southland would remain New Zealand's Scottish heartland. Now, we've told Otago's story here in a pretty positive way, focusing more on the successes than the failures, the ups than the downs. But it's important to remember that not every immigrant story turned out the way they hoped. Not everyone realised their dream.
My sense is that from the research that has been undertaken, it was a very law-abiding society, so there was very little in the way of crime. So with the discovery of gold, the settlement becomes much more, if we can use the term multicultural, there are many more ethnicities coming into Dunedin and then going to the goldfields. So it transitions into a sort of a family-based society to one that is dominated by young, single men who are not sort of grounded with family networks in terms of parental control, etc. So crime takes off in Dunedin, but also what we see happening is the mental health issue developing in this period as well.
But all that lay in the future for the pioneer settlement. By 1860, Dunedin had emerged as a solidly prosperous, if still somewhat straggling and primitive village settlement. Wheat and wool were providing export commodities, and a lively internal economy was beginning to thrive. Massive change and expansion were to follow with the discovery of gold, which changed forever the nature of the settlement and its people. Yet for all the benefits that gold would bring, many of the pioneer settlers would look back fondly on these early years as the truly golden days of colonial Otago. As one of Otago's earliest chroniclers, James Barr, was to write in 1879,
I can safely say that the first year in Otago was truly the happiest, and in an innocent way, the jolliest, that either before or since I have ever spent. It was one of hard work, a wherry only to live in, a house to build, scant rations at times, and flour and provisions to carry for 3 miles uphill through flax and fern, strapped across one's shoulders in a mirror basket. And yet there was really quite a charm about the life, a sense of novelty which is quite delightful, and when that had gone, there remained a sense of confidence in the future, which nerved to continued action and perseverance.
As we stand here today, surrounded by the grim faces of Otago's old identities, the pioneers of the early years, it's impossible not to admire the pluck and courage of these men and women who launched out on immigrant ships to try their luck on the far side of the world. Driven by lack of opportunity or by the large-scale dislocations of economics or social and technological change, or perhaps just by family situations that offered less than these migrants hoped for. Exiles or adventurers, reluctant migrants or gung-ho seekers after fortune, all of these people did it. They took their lives in their hands and they went as far as it was possible to go from Scotland, England and Ireland. They all took the journey to New Edinburgh.